Morning, everybody, for joining us on our weekly apprenticeship provider a collaboration call. Apologies for missing the call last week. I had an opportunity to speak to some potential clients in Dubai, which is all very exciting, and it was quite interesting because they came onto the session, everybody wearing face masks and gloves. So that was kind of like a bit of a culture shock. Actually, I was like the only person there that didn't have a face mask on.
Do they know that you can't catch it through a computer screen?
Yeah, absolutely. But interestingly, it's the law there. They have to wear them everywhere, like at work. They just don't, just not obviously at home, but they still do anyway. So it's like, it was quite interesting to see. So that was a bit of an interesting learn for me last week. So thank you, Paul, very much for chairing the session last week. Really appreciate that. And it sounded like you had a good conversation. I did watch back the recording. So and I think the purpose of the session today probably is twofold. So we're kind of getting into this swing now in regards to the changes and what the changes mean, and the lockdown restrictions, and we've seen some updates around some of the school changes and what that means, providers, etc. Christine, I'm aware you've been giving some updates around functional skills and what's happening in that arena, and there's been some good conversation there. And then I know we've been having some really good updates around endpoint assessment and stuff like that. So let's continue that conversation, if that's okay for everybody, in terms of any learns, any updates, anything to share. And again, if there's anything else that you do want to see as part of this conversation, then please do say. And then the other thing was, I think there was some good chat starting to happen around, what does delivery look like going forwards? And I know there was a good post, I think, Linda, was it you that put in the chat around the new Ofsted? Barbara, maybe it was you. I can't
Barbara, it was
remember.
Barbara. No, I cannot take credit for that. It was Barbara.
But fantastic flag in terms of it's good to see that there's some seeking to understand happening from perhaps some of the leadership happening in the sector, which is good. We can always have, it's good to have an opportunity to steer and support and be heard if that's what their opportunity is. So if there is any update on any of that as well, or just people's general feelings, then that would be really good as well. So is that all right for everybody?
Yeah.
All good.
Okay. So, Paul, would you mind just giving us a very quick summary then of the conversation last week, and if there's any kind of things that we need to pick up in terms of the theme of the conversation this week, or any adds, anything that we were kind of going to go away and kind of bring back into this call at all?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main bulk of the conversation last week, and thanks again, Christine, for giving everyone an update around the functional skills centre assessed grading, and the processes that we need to go through to ensure that's covered. From my perspective, we held our assessment panel meeting yesterday. I think that went very well. We covered every aspect as much as we could in terms of with each learner and the process that went through, the evidence requirements from diagnostic, identified gaps, starting point, evidencing, covering those identified areas for development, right the way through to having every learner having sat the test paper issued by the relevant awarding organisation and the outcome of that mock test paper. So I think we followed the guidance as much as possible. And we do have one learner, because again, the conversation last week was in terms of what if a learner hasn't got, isn't ready, or hasn't sat the test paper, or hasn't got sufficient evidence, and the recording of them as a fail. So we actually have got one learner who will be recorded as a fail for exactly that reason. And I think it was Barbara that raised that very important point last week, and we clarified what the requirements were there. We had a brief conversation about endpoint assessment and what's happening there. So I updated everyone from my perspective. Still haven't, we had an update from one of our endpoint assessment organisations that went AWOL, and basically that update was we won't have anything in place or an update for you for at least another 4 or 5 weeks. which just isn't
Just not getting a service at all, are you, with some of your partners?
That's terrible.
Yeah. We've gone back obviously to them and said, look, you know, we've got learners who are going to be entering Gateway, so we need to know what's going to be happening there. But on the flip side, we've got other endpoint assessment organisations who are very responsive, equally very keen to get paid, so they're chasing for payment. But that's working, you know, and going as smoothly as pre-COVID-19. And then we had a conversation about how everyone is looking to prepare for the relaxation of the restrictions. And again, I think it was Sue last week was asking for clarification around the updates, because the first update that came out for mainly aimed at schools and colleges talked about for apprenticeships, and it may be relevant. What it didn't clarify was actually it was only covering 16 to 19. But there was an update that was out last week, and I think a number of us commented on, and it was posted, was that actually from the 15th of June, that's all other apprentices, but that wasn't clear in the first update. So from Monday, if both the provider and the employer are in agreement, face-to-face delivery can take place, but obviously that's going to be subject to both parties having covered their COVID-19 risk assessments and making sure that everyone's as safe as possible. So I think I've covered everything in terms of the summary for last week.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it, Jackie. Go for it.
I was just, because apologies I wasn't here last week, but it was my birthday, so I wasn't going to work on my birthday. So, but just
You're forgiven. You're forgiven.
picking up on your comment there about, you know, an EPAO saying that they can't get back to you for 4 or 5 weeks. Was that in relation to any particular aspect of endpoint assessment, like the functional skills bit or the gateway bits, or being able to deliver the working out how to do the observation? Was it a particular element, or did they just give you a blanket, we're not talking to you for 4 or 5 weeks?
So see if I can actually get the email and tell you exactly what they've said, Jackie.
Because the reason I'm asking is because I try and do things that can help support the sector, because I'm an independent. So if it's something that's a blocker that I could maybe write about or do something, if I've got an idea. I mean, I might not. It might be something that's completely impossible to sort, and they've got a reason. But if it's just a blanket, we can't help you. That's
so what
that'd
they've
be
said
awesome, Jackie. Yeah.
What they've said is that they're now seeking advice. So this was on Monday last week. So they're only now just seeking advice from the External Quality Assurance Organisation.
They're only just doing it now.
Yeah. And we will be submitting a formal proposal to them, who would then pass it on to the Institute for Apprenticeships for consideration.
So do you know who the EQA provider is? Or do you know which apprenticeship it is? And then I can work out, because there are some EQA providers that are really proactive. So you've got potential hiccups in the whole process. So yeah, they should have contacted their EQA provider earlier, but I don't know what that reason might be. But then when they make the application to the EQA provider, some are very proactive, some have already got answers, others will have to digest it. So if you know what apprenticeship is, I can see what EQA provider it is.
It's a Junior Energy Manager Apprenticeship Standard.
Okay, it's probably the Institute of Apprenticeships, but I'll have a look.
Yeah. So they said if they agree that we have a valid case, a panel consisting of the Institute, the EQAO, the EMA, and the Junior Energy Manager Standard Trailblazer Group would need to meet to discuss the possible flexibility in the practical assessment.
Okay.
The process of changing the delivery of the practical assessment method will take at least 4 to 5 weeks.
Okay. I'm wondering whether it may be that particular apprenticeship hasn't come up, hasn't had an organisation taking apprentices through yet, so no one's actually had to think about flexibilities. Because I think what's been happening is, it's because it's been so, you know, so much going on, they've been focusing on the ones where they know apprentices are coming through, so maybe this wasn't on the radar. But I'll have a look and see who the EQA provider is. I'll do that while we're chatting and see if that might help in any way.
Thanks very much, Jackie.
I just want to make one very small comment on the back of what Paul's been saying as well. OCR's deadline for entering the results, I don't know, I did post about it yesterday, but it's tomorrow. So if anybody's with OCR, they need to get a wriggle on if they haven't done it already.
And NCFEs is the 19th.
Yeah, they've got a lot bit longer, but yeah.
Yeah, and Sitting Girls is 26.
Yeah, I was just trying to drag that date from the back of my head.
The one thing that we've had this week is we've been asked to confirm if we're going to do exams and reopening centres and do exams in centres. We've had a request to complete a form that came from Highfields, but I'm sure we're going to get it from others, to confirm that we've done all of the risk assessments, etc., and that will need to be sent to the AOs before the exams can take place, basically. So I think it's keeping that in mind as well. If you are reopening centres for some activities, that you double check with the AOs that there's, you know, any forms, anything you need to do for them before that exam can actually take place. So let's just not assume that we reopen the centre and we just go back to, you know, booking exams as before. There will be additional things we need to do from the AO side. I think they want to make sure from their side that you know, learners or anyone doesn't go back to them saying, you know, we were told we could take exams, and what precautions have you put in place, or what checks have you made to ensure that was a safe place for the learners who were with you, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on, Barbara. So yeah, it's a very, very valid and important point.
I was just looking at the junior energy manager, and the EQA is through the Institute for Apprenticeships, which means it's open awards. So they're usually quite proactive. So it may be the case that they've just been looking at flexibilities based on when companies have been approaching them with when the EPAO has had companies approach them for apprentices coming to Gateway, and it's just that one's at the back of the list, because they are right in terms of the timescale, because they have got to Open Awards does have to take it through to the IFA, and they have to have a discussion with the Trailblazer group to agree the flexibilities. I don't know, in terms of the employer you're working with, that you've got apprentices at Gateway, have you had any conversations with them about how I don't know what the EPA activities in it are, but have you had any conversations about how it could be delivered in the context of COVID?
Yeah, so Jackie, we've been working with the EMA, the Endpoint Assessment Organisation, for over a year now.
Right, okay.
And we were conscious that we are still the only national training provider, but there is one
Right.
local training provider offering it. So we were conscious that we were the first tranche going through Gateway.
So that would be why then. Right, okay.
We deliver mock endpoint assessments as part of our programme. We've invited the EMA to our mock endpoint assessment days. Sorry, we call them interim endpoint assessment days. They came to one in November last year. We were then asking them how they planned endpoint assessment to be delivered, and we have been supporting them in terms of how best that can happen. We were talking about whether it will be on employer sites, at neutral sites,
Right, okay,
whether it will be simulated, whether it will be, etc.
Yep.
And how the knowledge tests would be delivered, and how the interviews and so on would be delivered as well. So we've been putting lots of suggestions forward, and we've had very little back, if I'm being brutally honest. So this isn't all of a sudden we're getting learners coming up to Gateway and us saying, what are you doing? This is us for a long time been chasing in terms of what is endpoint assessment going to look like.
Right, okay. Oh, well, I mean, you know, it's disappointing from hearing what you're saying. One of the reasons why I was asking is because when the EPAO has to put forward a case, if you like, for the flexibilities, they have to put the ideas of solutions as to way of delivery, rather than just saying we need flexibility. They need to put forward possible solutions to that flexibility, so that then the EQA provider can look at it and then put it forward. But I think it sounds like you've probably already done it, but one of the things I was thinking is, if you've got ideas already of what those flexibilities are, if you haven't told them, let them know, because basically what they'll be doing, what they should be doing is, and hopefully they are, is putting together a case for their EQA provider saying which particular elements are having trouble because of COVID, what the possible solutions are to delivering it. But when they do that, they have to do it in a way that it means that if there's any other EPA provider, they could do it too, because what the EQA provider must do is they must look at it on a apprenticeship standard level, irrespective of which provider is delivering, because it's got to be about consistency.
Yep.
So if you've got ideas on how that could be delivered, your employer's got ideas, let your EPA know, because essentially you'll be saving a bit of work for them, because that's exactly what they've got to do to put the case forward. So they should be doing it. I hope they are. But if you have had discussions with your employer about how those sorts of things could take place, let your EPAO know, because then they can put it in their case for discussion with the IFA.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have had those discussions. So we had a conference call with them on Wednesday last week,
right,
and talked exactly about what the options could be in terms of, the interview is fairly more straightforward in terms of using the video conferencing, and we suggested that the issue is around the 2-hour observation of an energy audit, and it's how that can take place. Mm-hmm. So again, we've said, whether that's a recording or whether it's live but remote, and they've taken those considerations away. So
I'm wondering whether it might be worth their while. There's another organisation that I used to work for, Energy and Utility Skills, which doesn't do junior energy manager, but they did a lot of endpoint assessment in the energy industry with observations. And obviously I've long since left, but what I am still in contact with their assessors. And I know they put, one of their assessors put a post up a few days ago saying they've carried out their first ever remote observation.
Excellent.
But the reason why I'm thinking of it is they've proven it can be done. So maybe I'll have a chat with the person, and maybe their experience could be used to support observations in the junior energy manager context. But as I say, I don't know the details of the standard or the endpoint assessment, so they might not be yours might be on a construction site and theirs was in a power station or something, but there might be something that could help that process. It's still got to go through the process, unfortunately, so I'm sad there is that time frame, but there might be things that could be done to help support it. So I'll have a chat with the assessor I used to work with and see if he's, do you mind me giving him your details? If
no, that would be amazing, Jackie. Thank you. Anything to help would be great.
Yeah. All right, thanks. I'll do that. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily it's not going to sort out your situation here and now, but it might help with things to a solution. Okay, I'll make a note of it so I can follow up.
Thank you, Jackie. And I think all of these, it's just kind of just nudging things forward, isn't it? Because I'm just scared of it, that I was on a board meeting 2 weeks ago with a provider, just as the guidance had come out around their 16 to 19-year-olds, if you want to go back to face-to-face, and then as of this day, if you want. And interestingly, the advisor on that board was saying, ESFA is saying you have to go back to face-to-face now. So I think we're going to have to just navigate the next couple of weeks, next couple of months in a really careful, considered way, because if we're not careful, we'll get bad advice saying the IFAT saying this, or ESFA saying this, or Ofqual saying this, or whatever, and then we'll all just ping back to how it was before, and then we might get caught out again. And actually, I think we shouldn't lose this learning that we've had over the last 3 months, really. So,
well, I mean, you're spot on, really, because from an endpoint assessment perspective, and I think probably Linda would reiterate this, if there are ways, I mean, there's a question which I know Linda's very passionate about, is the timing to do things, because some of the changes that have been made previously have taken months, and they've managed to do changes much quicker in COVID. So what's the process that's made it quicker this time? But on my second point, and I've totally forgotten what it is. It's literally just...
I'll step in, Jackie, then on that point, because I would say, be it endpoint assessment or training at the moment, sometimes you need to challenge and push back. So I was having a conversation with a training provider on Monday, actually, who has very much taken up the blended learning and online learning. Not surprisingly, because it's hospitality, you're not going back in anyway for a long time. So it's going to be the same for training. and assessment. But she was having a conversation with somebody quite senior in the ESFA, and they're going, well, why haven't you got loads of people on breaks and learning? Why would I have loads of people on breaks and learning? We've been delivering the learning. And what she said, she was really surprised at the lack of understanding still about what is online learning and that interaction. And I think there is a really big educational piece, and it's not just, if you like, people delivering that might be holding on to certain things that they like. It's actually the regulators as well, and it's been the same with endpoint assessment. I mean, on the 13th of March I was at an endpoint assessment conference where IFIT were very much, really don't want to give up these observations, or this could be very tricky. And within a week, of course, that was all changed. But Paul, on your point, that there is a process, and actually what we found for hospitality and retail was as EPAOs, and there were a couple of us that are very gobby, we had to be very gobby, and we actually really had to force the process. And I think that the adjective that was put to me was, thank you for your persistence, Linda. That didn't mean thank you for your persistence, Linda. That essentially meant, you know, go away type thing. But it was really a case, and it took us 6 weeks to get that in place. And what had to happen is, yours will be slightly easier because there aren't so many EPAOs involved, but it was actually having to get all of the EPAOs to agree, as Jackie said, exactly to what the alternatives would be. But it was really very much pushing the agenda. So if the EPAO doesn't push the agenda, the EQAP is not going to jump on it, and they're not going to push the agenda with IFIT and the root panel. So you have to sort of get all of those people on board, and jumping up and down quite a lot and pulling quite a few emotional heartstrings. I mean, that's what we did in the end. We're like, well, that's fine then. So you want thousands of apprentices who could possibly be made redundant anyway, not to have anything. You think that's acceptable? And it's almost, it was that type of language that seemed to move them a bit more than some of the technicalities, because they will get caught up in the technicalities rather than actually what's the right thing to do.
I agree with you. I think it's always going back to, are you disadvantaging the learners by not allowing us to look at different options, basically? And that's what we've done as well.
Yeah. And I think thank you, Linda, you did remind me what was in my head. That had just disappeared. It was to say also, because these flexibilities are coming through, so there will be one for the junior energy manager once it's discussed. But I think one of the things to really to focus on with this is what changes have really worked, because if they're starting to say go back to face now as we transition back, then just like Linda says, the ones that are used to doing traditional ways will say, right, let's just go back to how it was. But if something's working remotely, then why not harness that and allow it and make that change the assessment plan? Because what we don't want to do is, it's been made very clear that these flexibilities in endpoint assessment are temporary, and that's right to say that, but it's also right to say that if something temporary works, then let it carry on. And I'm not sure whether there's any plans to actually find out what's worked. I mean, maybe there is. I mean, I'm just speculating there. Maybe it's something I can do, find out from EPAOs what flexibilities have worked, and see if then that can lead to actually embedding the changes within the assessment plan itself. Because there will be some that just have worked but really badly, so it's better to go back, but there will be some that will be brilliant. And I mean, knowledge tests are quite a classic, because there's still quite a lot of EPAOs that very much work on sort of old school exam style. There's no reason why they couldn't move to remote delivery and remote invigilation. And I'm not saying that's easy, but what's the harm in making that push for it if it's something that works and makes sure that everyone's still able to access it as well?
I think you're both absolutely right. I think one of the we have learned massive lessons, and I think we've been forced into a situation where we've had to make these adjustments, and it would be a real shame if some of these successful adjustments do just disappear into the ether. But I think it's going to be very much that we still need to, we will need to make the noises. And bless you, Linda, your gobbiness is one of your endearing qualities, I have to say.
Hear, 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 hear.
Yeah, and that comes from a gobby person herself, but anyway. No, but I do think I think it's something that we are really going to have to bang the drum about, because institutions like IF8, they are very set in their ways. They're a government organisation, and they might very much have the mindset, right, COVID's over now, right, back to normal. The assessment plans and the standards, they have to be followed to the letter. That's what's on the system. We can't be going about messing with those and all the rest of it. And I know there's like reviews and what have you going on with some of the ones that have been in place a little bit longer. But I think it's down to us from the sector to start shouting and screaming to say, as Linda's quite rightly said, it's better for the learners, it's better for the employers. You know, this gives more flexibility. This means that, you know, we're in more of a digital age. There's all this stuff that we now know that we can embrace effectively. Why are we not making the most of the lessons that we learned in this unusual time? So I think we're just going to have to continue to be gobby.
Christine, I think you're
as well,
absolutely...
Funding will drive it as well. So I think, again, the savvy training providers actually have realised, of course, if you do a lot more online learning, guess what? You're not paying out on mileage. That is a massive saving, particularly if you are a large provider. You know, those are very, very hefty costs. And that to the FD is like gold dust.
Yeah,
and once
overnight accommodation as well.
Yeah,
you've got your travel, you've got your overnights, you've got your meals, and all the rest of it. But then there's the other side as well. There's the from the assessor or trainer or tutor or whatever you want to call them now. There's the perspective of them. It's the work-life balance as well. I'm sure they would much rather be at home at night than have to be away as much, and I'm sure that, you know, people don't want to be traveling hours to get to see a learner for maybe a couple of hours. And you know, it's that better use of time, which means that there can be that better work-life balance for people.
I think as well, just to add my voice to that choir as well, is as part of our reopening plan, we've looked at how we can minimise, well, obviously include social distancing, but minimise that contact and that potential spread. And if we've got tutors who are then visiting one workplace, then another, then another, then another, then another, actually that's not socially responsible for us to send our guys out and potentially just spread that all over. So where we are, we're able to move online, but where we're not, we are looking at sort of hub and spoke models where we bring people together in a more controlled environment. So we do appreciate that online isn't always possible, and in some courses it's actually not desirable. So using the hub and spoke that we can more safely control, although there might be more cost in that, actually that's the better way of doing it. And as Barbara said, it's about what's best for the learners, and that might be what's best for them in that instance.
Erica, if I could just pop in there. So I was just thinking, I think there probably needs to be some analysis on the success of learners over this period as well, because I genuinely think that some of the learners, you've got the engagement piece to begin with, you know, getting them online, getting them to attend appointments, but you have that problem anyway sometimes. But I genuinely think, you know, from an employer's point of view, having somebody attend an hour session at their desk and do a bit of virtual learning, online classroom, whatever, and take that back, I genuinely think it could have a real positive effect and increase people's learning and their attention span.
Absolutely, because the science that sits behind this is the brain science. That's why virtual learning works so well. And I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, and people are probably expecting it as well. But you know, the fact that, you know, what I'm seeing at the moment with some of the providers I'm working with, particularly those who've got ex-HMIs on the board, they've got inspectors who are not learning specialists, but people who know about inspection and CIF inspection, not EIF inspection. are the people who are advising providers to go back to face to face, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but that's my experience over the last couple of weeks. So I think there's an onus on providers here to take charge of their own strategy and not follow blindly. And that's exactly what I've just written the blog about this morning, is to say, you know, consider what's working for you and step up and have some balls about it and be gobby and all this stuff. You know, this is a classic time for us to step up and say, it's now time for change. If we just ping back to how we did before, you know, we're going to be out of business we're not going to have a sector, because of all the reasons that we just talked about in terms of cost, in terms of well-being. We know that we've already got tutors and assessors with 45, 50, 60 on a caseload who are absolutely knackered driving around doing this kind of stuff. So I think we really need to start shaking up the sector and banging that drum that you're talking about. Lucy, I know you're exactly on the same wavelength that I am.
Yeah, definitely. Can I just say thanks for having me in the gang. This is my first time here. I was hoping to get here last week. I haven't got the excuse of a birthday. Happy birthday, Jackie. But unfortunately didn't make it, but thank you for having me. I've come in quietly listening. It seemed very intelligent and very educational at first, and I thought, oh, maybe it's a bit over my head. I'll just sit here quietly. And then people started chucking in words like gobby and disruptive and digital drums, and I thought, I'm definitely in the right place here. So thank you for having me. Couldn't agree more. Love the article, Erica. And actually, I've been procrastinating on an article myself about hating the term new normal. So you're giving me the rocket this morning to think I need to get that sorted and get that out there. But it's all of these things about going back, and normal's just a horrible word. Why would we want that? We want change. We want to create a new world, not have the sort of, you know, look at the world we're in and look at what normal is. All these terms of racism, sexism, abuse, you know, have to be traditional in a classroom. We want rid of all that. We want to start again. So yeah, definitely in the right place, definitely on the sort of digital drum banging, and certainly a massive fan of blended learning, which is why me and Erica have bonded so well and often have soapbox moments. So thanks for having me.
Well,
thanks, Lucy.
I'm just thinking as well from an endpoint assessment perspective, on the same vein as what you've just been talking about, Erica. You've heard us talking about how everything goes back via the Trailblazer groups for approval, which is the right thing to do because they were the design bodies. But the Trailblazer groups themselves, just like you were talking about inspectors from the old EIF that are advising when it's really CIF now. In Trailblazer contexts, I am overgeneralizing here, okay, so just bear that in mind. But they are usually made up of very experienced learning and development experts within an industry who are in their 50s, 60s, some retired. So it's possibly the same sort of thing there in terms, so maybe there's work, lobbying, whatever, with Trailblazer groups as well as with, you know, the IFA and the EQA providers, because if they have to run things through the Trailblazer group for this is the way we do it, if they're not used to doing things remotely and are very traditional, then they will be a blocker as well to making that change. So it's not just about the sort of government bodies, if you like, it's those that are advising it too. Because they want advisors, they ask for advisors, but they're usually very senior people that have been in the industry a long time, which is the right thing, but not necessarily in terms of adapting new ways and new technologies for things.
Yeah,
I actually sat on a Trailblazer for the real estate when I was at in my last job, and I sat there with a guy you'll all know, it's Simon Ashworth. So we went together, and actually we represented a training provider. But what we did was that he looked at things from sort of the training provider perspective and, you know, is this feasible policy wise and whatever. And I actually went with an employer hat on, and obviously from a sales perspective going, actually, I've got to sell this to an employer. Does this make sense to them? And, you know, can you actually go out and say, right, you're going to have an apprentice. This is what you need to do. And at the end of it, the endpoint assessment is going to be this. And actually, could I sell this to them as a concept? So I think that actually, as you've just said, Jackie, the Trailblazer groups tend to be made up of L&D specialists who are very, very well educated. They know what makes good learning, but maybe aren't as connected to actually how that gets applied to the employment aspect of the apprenticeship. So I think that there's still some work to be done on the makeup of Trailblazer groups and who's represented in them, because it does tend to be the same type of person, not the same people, but they've all got similar backgrounds. And, you know, just looking around here, we're all a big group of white faces. You know, where's the representation in just even in this group with 10 people or whatever? So actually Trailblazers get really sucked in. So that's just my 2 pence worth on that.
No, it's true. And I think the IFA have, I can't remember the name of it, but they have their apprentice ambassadors, I think they call them.
Yes, they have, yeah.
And they're the apprentices themselves. So there's I suppose harnessing that will help things as well. You know, it's all very well me saying all these thoughts. It's about the reality of trying to do it. But
yeah, and I think the challenge with the Trailblazer groups is, as we touched on the other week, didn't we, Erica? Because you walked away from one. You know, it's a voluntary role. It's a thankless task.
I wouldn't say I walked away.
Okay, so I'm being polite. You ran away as fast as you could.
You blazed the trail.
I
got it over the line and gave my notice the next day. Let's just put it that way.
So I think, I think it's a challenging job in itself, and I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a real need to. I can't think of a better word, infiltrate the Trailblazer groups, you know, to actually make sure that these changes, these lessons that we're learning are actually taken on board. And I think, you know, when I look at the structure now for creating a Trailblazer, for creating the standards and the assessment plans and the funding bands, it is very, it's very process driven, it's very regimented.
It always was. It wasn't about the learning or the content. It was about having to fit into a model that you were dictated to. That's exactly what it was about.
But I think the way it used to go, it was it was a much longer drawn out process, and then the funding dropped out the end when you as the providers or the employers sort of put the case forward for what you thought the funding should be. And I think there's a real concern now that the way it's all going to be done, it's almost going to be funding driven again. So the quality of what's going to come out in the standards and the assessment plans is going to be driven by how much IFA decides that this particular apprenticeship is worth. But I think on the back of that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because using methods that are more remote, maybe thinking about the ways that we can use technology and embrace technology and have that blended model, that is actually more cost effective, and that can help to support the fact that we can still get high quality apprenticeship training that is delivered within a cost effective way. I wasn't going to say much this week.
Don't be silly. Of course you were, Christine. Of course you were. Don't be silly. Barbara, you've had your hand up for a wee while. No, we love you for it. We love you for it. Barbara.
Yeah, I think for me, I agree with everything that's been said, and probably following on from what Adam was saying. The one thing that worries me with the whole technology piece is who are we leaving behind, and what are we doing to support those learners who haven't got access to technology, who are, you know, have only got access to technology when they're at work, or, you know, who have been furloughed and haven't got that access. So I think we really need to do an equality impact assessment on what is the impact of moving everything online. And I think really important that we think of that as we look at the new future. Like Lucy was saying, I agree with you, there's no new back to normal, that's like no, but what does the future look like, and are we equipping all of our apprentices, our employability learners, with the right tools to actually being able to work online, to give them, and it's not even the tools as in just the, you know, have they got the space to do the work when they're at home? Have they got the right environment? And that's where actually having centres or hubs like we were talking about, where they can come and do some work because you're giving them those bits of technology, might actually be the way forward. So a real hybrid delivery model where, you know, people will be quite happy to do things from home because they've got their office, they're all nicely set up, but then also allowing others who might not have that to, you know, give them the space, give them the equipment, give them the support, because some people will have educational needs that still need supporting, and doing it online is not necessarily the best way forward for them. So I think we can do all of that, but we can't do it without that really strong equality assessment in my head, and deciding and listening to people, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and listening to everyone, not just the ones that are gobby. It's actually listening to the quiet ones where it hasn't worked and they haven't said, and how do we do that, I think is really key.
Can I just jump in? Because me and Eric had a chat about this yesterday, particularly around the technology and people not having sort of access to technology. And I think as educationalists, as learning providers, we've got to take responsibility for that and give people them opportunities. And what I was saying is, we've talked about how we want to give our tutors a better work-life balance. Yes, definitely. And actually, let's remember, they might be quite anxious about going out. And Adam made a really great point that actually COVID, you shouldn't be having to travel around more than you need to. So for me, if we're going to have cost savings built into that model with this blended approach, then, you know, Christy mentioned about the overnight stays, night in the Premier Inn, what, 40, 50 pounds, depending on where you are in the country, you can get a tablet for that cost. So for me, that should be built into that cost saving. We should provide the technology for those that haven't got it. That should be something that they can keep. And I think we've got a job to support people becoming more digitally literate. And I think that starts with them having access to technology. And I think we've got to take that responsibility within our cost savings, because it's a, you know, one night in a Premier Inn to be able to provide someone with technology. You know, how many nights in Premier Inns are tutors living there at the moment? 3-4 times a week potentially. You're still getting a massive cost saving. And I think we've got, we know we've got digital literacy skills in this country, so we should be supporting. And again, it's you know, you're right, completely right, Barbara, that we should be listening to everybody. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the gobbier ones that get heard, and I think it's where the gobbiness comes in with the government sort of saying, we're talking about digital literacy, we know it's an issue, we know we've got another skills gap here, what are we doing about it? And, you know, for me, it should be providing people with the technology. So I'll get off my soapbox now, but thanks.
Can I just come in and just share a few things as well? I think comments, first of all, Erica, that you made around former HMIs and inspectors is absolutely valid. We had a monitoring visit in February, and I have to say, having been through probably almost double figures now throughout my career at Ofsted inspections, it was the most engaging, friendly, supportive experience I've ever had from Ofsted. And it's because the new EIF is allowing them to do that. So I'll give you a few, for instance, one of the comments that the lead inspector made was, and this was around our observation policy, and so on, said, so what if the tutor hasn't got a learning plan or a lesson plan for that session? As long as the learner's learning and it's clear and they're engaged, who cares? And that was just so refreshing to be able to see and to hear. The other comment was exactly on that, where we stated our case, and this was around governance, where we'd explicitly sought guidance from a former inspector. And the lead inspector wasn't overly critical, but said, how did you vet them? Because, you know, if they are an associate inspector, and said, and just so you're aware, Ofsted actively tells all of its HMIs and associates that they should not be doing any paid for work for any providers giving guidance. So that's clear. So that's the first point. The second point is how did you vet them? Because actually, if they were a former inspector, they won't even be aware of the changes to the inspection framework, which is from September last year. But even if they are, how many have they actually been on? So if you're an active HMI, you're full-time employed by Ofsted. If you're an associate, then obviously you may not yet have been on an inspection for the full framework. So therefore you won't be fully aware, and you won't have attended all of the training sessions. So actually you've been given the wrong guidance and the wrong information there. So that's the second point. With regards to, and I'm really pleased that Ofsted have put this invitation out to ask for the input in terms of online and remote delivery and the impact around that. Because I think for a long time now as a sector, where providers may have wanted to move forward with the use of technology and integrating that into their delivery models, they've been reluctant to, because the audit guidance doesn't support it and the Ofsted guidance doesn't support it. We, in 2012, as a sector, had FELTAG set up, so the Further Education Learning Technologies Advisory Group. And government set that up to help in the main further education sector. But the outcome of that was to ask providers to ensure that they are able to and can demonstrate that they can deliver a certain percentage of their programs using learning technology. Now, it wasn't mandatory that they had to use it. It was just that they could demonstrate they could. And it started at 5% and then moved up to 20%. Unfortunately, since 2016, FELTAG still exists, but it's fell by the wayside. And I think that something that should be happening is that either FELTAG comes back to the fore or something equivalent to FELTAG comes and starts to support the sector in demonstrating, but actually make it mandatory now that the use of technology must be integrated into programs, not optional. I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, I'm totally with you actually, Paul. And I've never heard that term before. What was the term again? FELTAG?
FELTAG, so it's FELTAG.
FE Learning Technology.
Further Education Learning Technologies Advisory Group.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, because at one point it looked like it was going to be mandatory that you had to have a certain percentage that was
that's right. It was even going to be on the ILR. They had to put on the ILR that some of it had been done online.
Yes, absolutely, and it was quite a significant thing to be considering. But the other thing I think to take on board with that, and I think you're absolutely right, Paul, is, you know, we've got, and we got what Lucy said as well, we have got this skills gap. And we've got this situation that's emerging, that we've now got the essential digital skills framework. We've got these new essential digital skills qualifications that are going to be coming online in the next few months. I've not heard that they're not, so I'm assuming that they are still going to be, although we don't have any AOs approved by Ofqual yet. However, that is now the government saying that they're giving digital skills the same parity as maths and English, because they're being independently funded under the AEB. So it's putting technology use back on the map with maths and English. And for me, I can see that that will start to filter through with things like inspections, where for what Ofsted look for now with maths and English is that you've got a baseline assessment and you've got continuous development of maths and English throughout the whole of the programme, regardless of whether the learners need to take the formal qualifications or not. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't start to see that interweaving of digital technology as well, and using that effectively to support the learners. And I think Lucy's point about, you know, rerouting some of the savings to help people to engage with it, because you're absolutely right, Barbara, there are people that you know, can't access this technology, but if they're not given the skills and the ability to engage with the technology, then they're going to be seriously disadvantaged and left behind in the future.
Absolutely. And I think we do need to support them. And I think you're absolutely right about the English and math. And I was talking to Skills Forward just last week in August. They are launching their initial assessment for digital skills, which will be, you know, on par, just the same as your English and math, etc., with the same support online. And I think that could be also a really good way of having that starting point, you know, and checking where, you know, learners are starting, where are their gaps, what do they need, etc. So I agree with you. I think it needs to be absolutely weaved into everything that we do, because that's what the world of the future looks like. And if they don't have the right skills, and I think it's really digital skills in the broadest sense of like social media, all of that, you know, they're going to be left behind.
Yeah, I mean, I think the digital skills framework is very solid around that. It's not, it is about the sort of the everyday stuff that people need to be able to do. And I think it shifted a little bit away from, you know, where we used to have the ECDL. There was a lot around being able to do databases and spreadsheets and things like that, and that's where the focus was. I think the new framework is much more realistic for what people will need on a day-to-day basis, and the whole thing is sort of encased, if you like, with security and being safe when you're online. And I think there was I did a piece of work with my sister a couple of years ago around cybersecurity in schools, and that was massive because kids do have earlier access to things like mobile phones, but they're not always taught how to do it responsibly and safely. And if that doesn't happen and they come out of school and they just carry on in the same way as they're being exposed to more things that could put them at harm, then that knowledge and that understanding is so much more important. I'm sorry, I have got a lot of soapboxes, haven't I?
It's really valid, Christine. You make really valid points. So yeah, no, we appreciate all of your contribution. Yeah.
And just from my perspective as well, talking about the technology, I know if I was working with a training provider and they came to me and said, right, well, we know we're going to have to buy tablets for everybody, and even though they're taking more than the lion's share of the drawdown, I'm more than happy to have that conversation about sharing that cost with them. Definitely, because that's giving something back. So I'd be more than happy to do that.
I was just going to say, Erica, that if you, and it's something I've done a lot recently, but if you really, really look at the EIF and really get down into it really has got the digital going all the way through it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
absolutely. With all the digital, with all the personal development skills and transferable skills. And, you know, to your point, Lucy, I've just come from an employer provider who were just launching their program, and they were buying tablets for every single learner because they were in a retail environment, and because of the security on back office computers and things like that, there's no way that they could have access to everything that they needed. So I think that it is a way to go forward, and I think people will start to look at that to be inclusive. But I equally agree and are very passionate about that not everybody's got those digital skills to begin with, and we need to give them and support them with those and take them on that journey with us, or, you know, provide alternatives and at different levels to support that that journey. So thank you.
I don't know enough about the sort of digital sort of framework, if you will, and the content that's included in this sort of digital literacy piece. But if there is anybody that would be interested in working together on the digital literacy piece, and we'd be keen to create something that then, obviously, if they're getting a given technology with a digital literacy course built onto it, and then obviously shown how to use it, I think that might be a good starting point.
I'll send you the frameworks.
Thank you,
Lucy.
I know that we're getting to the end of sort of our hour, and I've got another call at 11, so I need a little comfort break between, so I'm going to dive off. Could I suggest that for next week we maybe look at a topic of mistakes that we've all made while introducing online learning? Because I think we're starting to all talk about how we actually use that, looking at FELTAG. Lucy's obviously made some really good points there about how you actually provide equipment and whatever. And I have worked previously where we did give everyone an iPad or a tablet that then just vanished, disappeared, and went along with the learner. So obviously there's learnings to make from that as well. But if we could kind of have that as a theme, I'd appreciate that if no one else would.
Yeah, good idea, Adam.
Yeah, that I think that's a nice evolution from the conversation that we've had today, and it's exploring things in different ways, isn't it? So yeah, thank you, Adam, for putting your head above the parapet and appreciating that. And yes, do feel free to kind of get your comfort, get a cup of coffee, etc. We'll see you next week. Thank you, Adam. Cheers. Thank you. Okay, guys, thank you so much for the conversations today. It just feels like we're starting to kind of gain some more momentum now, doesn't it? And it's nice that we've got that kind of training provider, that EPAO, that independent, that L&D. We've got the whole package here. And Christine, I know you were saying that's part of the reason why you love these conversations, is because they're so holistic. So so thank you, everybody. Yeah, Lucy, thank you for the offer in regards to if there's a piece of work there, and Christine sharing the frameworks and stuff to see if there's something that can come out of the back of that. And I'm just going to do a bit of research around FELTAG in regards to that. Paul, maybe we have a conversation offline about that, and I can understand a bit more from you around that, because I think there might be something.
I think I've got that publication as well.
Okay.
So I've got.
If you want to stick it in the chat then for everybody to access, yeah.
I've got to go on a tutorial at 11, so bear with me, but I will do it. I'll do it, you know, by lunchtime. Or let you know.
And it was something that was endorsed by JISC at the time, and JISC did a lot of work around it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your input. Really, really helpful. So if we're happy to take the conversation on to Adam's suggestion for next week, what have been the learns? So not let's have a moan about stuff and let's kind of think about how difficult it was, but what were the learns and what we learned from introducing or working with learning technology that's going to benefit everybody. I think that would be, if everyone's happy with that, I think that would be a great conversation to have.
Cool. Sounds good.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay, guys, thanks very much. Thanks very much for dialing in today. Keep being active on the chat and sharing resources and stuff. That's starting to pick up quite nicely as well. And as soon as we hear any kind of update on this Ofsted interest as well, it'll be good if anybody sees anything, do pop that in the chat as well. So brilliant. Thank you, guys. Thanks very much. And I'll see you all next week.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.